Hi, I'm Frances and welcome to my channel. I thought today I would do a reading, just a small excerpt of one of my favorite parts of Stephen King's It. And I have read this book, I think 4 or 5 times. It's one of my favorite books, and if you've read it, then I'm sure you know it is an absolute masterpiece. And I just love this book. I would love to do the audiobook of it, but I think it would take me about 2 years. So I'm going to read this excerpt. Probably one of the reasons that I really love this book is that I had an experience, one or two, more than one, sort of like the kids in this book. And if you've ever experienced something like that, you understand so much more of the book, because I also was living in a small town. And when you see something that is not supposed to be, and I'm going off the top of my head, but somewhere in the book he says it's not that it scares you, it's that it offends you. And that is so perfect, because I forget exactly how he says it, but he says that it offends you because it's not supposed to be, and it's offensive. It's offensive to your idea of what the world is, and what's supposed to be in the world and not supposed to be. Anyway, let me just do this little reading. So this is the part where Mike Hanlon encounters the bird, the huge bird. It's one of my favorite parts, and I'm going to just do a reading of that part of the book because it's one of my favorites. So let me start. Okay, I'll just start on page 276, where he says, the first note his father left him in that spring of 1958 was scribbled on the back of an envelope and held down with a salt shaker. The air was spring warm, wonderfully sweet, and his mother had opened all the windows. No chores, the note read. If you want to, ride your bike out to Pasteur Road. You'll see a lot of tumbled masonry and old machinery out in the field on your left. Have a look around, bring back a souvenir. Don't go near the cellar hole, and be back before dark. You know why. Mike knew why, all right. He told his mother where he was going, and she frowned. Why don't you see if Randy Robinson wants to go with you? Yeah, okay, I'll stop by and ask him, Mike said. He did, too. But Randy had gone up to Bangor with his father to buy seedling potatoes. So Mike rode his bike over to Pasteur Road alone. It was a goodish ride, a little over 4 miles. Mike reckoned it was 3 o'clock by the time he leaned his bike against an old wooden slat fence on the left side of Pasteur Road and climbed into the field beyond. He would have maybe an hour to explore, and then he would have to start home again. Ordinarily, his mother would not be upset with him as long as he was back by 6 when she put dinner on the table, but one memorable episode had taught him that wasn't the case this year. On that one occasion, when he had been late for dinner, she had been nearly hysterical. She took after him with a dish rag, whopping him with it as he stood open-mouthed in the kitchen entryway, his wicker creel with the rainbow trout in it at his feet. Don't you ever scare me like that, she had screamed. Don't you ever. Don't you ever, 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 ever. Each ever had been punctuated by another dish rag swat. Mike had expected his father to step in and put a stop to it, but his father hadn't done so. Perhaps he knew that if he did, she would turn her wildcat anger on him as well. Mike had learned the lesson. One whopping with a dish rag was all it took. Home before dark. Yes, ma'am. Righto. He walked across the field toward the Titanic ruin standing in the center. This was, of course, the remains of the Kitchener Ironworks. He had ridden past it, but had never thought to actually explore it, and he had never heard any kids saying that they had. Now, stooping to examine a few tumbled bricks that had formed a rough cairn, He thought he could understand why. The field was dazzlingly bright, washed by sun from the spring sky. Occasionally, as a cloud passed before the sun, a great shudder of shadow would travel slowly across the field. But there was something spooky about it all the same. A brooding silence that was broken only by the wind. He felt like an explorer who had found the last remnants of some fabulous lost city. Up ahead and to the right, he saw the rounded side of a massive tile cylinder rising out of the high field grass. He ran over to it. It was the ironworks main smokestack. He peered into its bore and felt a fresh chill worm up his spine. It was big enough so he could have walked into it if he had wanted, but he didn't want to. God knew what strange gunk there might be clinging to the smoke-blackened inner tiles, or what nasty bugs or beast might have taken up residence inside. The wind gusted. When it blew across the mouth of the fallen stack, it made a sound eerily like the sound of the wind vibrating the wax strings he and his dad put in the moose blowers every spring. He stepped back nervously, suddenly thinking about the movie he and his father had watched last night on the early show. It had been called Rodan, and watching it had seemed like great fun at the time, his father laughing and shouting, "Get that bird, Mikey," every time Rodan made its appearance. Mike shooting with his finger until his mom popped her head in and told him to hush up before they gave her a headache with the noise. It didn't seem so funny now. In the movie, Rodan had been released from the bowels of the earth by these Japanese coal miners who had been digging the world's deepest tunnel. And looking into the black bore of this pipe, it was all too easy to imagine that bird crouched at the far end, leathery bat-like wings folded over its back, staring at the small, round boy face looking into the darkness, staring with its gold-ringed eyes. Shivering, Mike pulled back. He walked a ways down the smokestack, which had sunken into the earth to half of its circumference. The land rose slightly, and on impulse he scrambled his way up on top. The stack was a lot less scary on the outside, its tiled surface sun-warm. He got to his feet and strolled along, holding his arms out. The surface was really too wide for him to need to worry about falling off, but he was pretending he was a tight wire walker in the circus, liking the way the wind blew through his hair. At the far end, he jumped down and began to examine stuff. More bricks, twisted molds, hunks of wood, pieces of rusty machinery. Bring back a souvenir, his father's note had said. He wanted a good one. He wandered closer to the mill's yawning cellar hold, looking at the debris, being careful not to cut himself on the broken glass. There was a lot of it around. Mike was not unmindful of the cellar hold and his father's warning to stay out of it. Neither was he unmindful of the death that had been dealt out on this spot 50-odd years before. He supposed that if there was a haunted place in Derry, this was it. But either in spite of that or because of it, he was determined to stay until he found something really good to take back and show his father. He moved slowly and soberly toward the cellar hold, changing his course to parallel its ragged side, when a warning voice inside whispered that he was getting too close, that a bank weakened by the spring rains could crumble under his heels and pitch him into that hole, where God only knew how much sharp iron might be waiting to impale him like a bug, leaving him to die a rusty, twitching death. He picked up a window sash and tossed it aside. Here was a dipper big enough for a giant's table, its handle rippled and warped by some unimaginable flash of heat. Here was a piston too big for him to even budge, let alone lift. He stepped over it and... What if I find a skull? He thought suddenly, the skull of one of the kids who were killed here while they were hunting for chocolate Easter eggs, back in whenever it was. He looked around the sun-washed, empty field, nastily shocked by the idea. The wind blew a low conch note in his ears, and another shadow cruised silently across the field, like the shadow of a giant bat or bird. He became aware, all over again, of how quiet it was here, and how strange the field looked, with its straggling piles of masonry and its beached iron hulks leaning this way and that. It was as if some horrid battle had been fought here long ago. "Don't be such a dip," he replied uneasily to himself. "They found everything there was to find 50 years ago, after it happened. And even if they didn't, some other kid or grown up would have found the rest since then. Or do you think you're the only person who ever came here hunting for souvenirs?" No, I don't think that, but what? The rational side of his mind demanded, and Mike thought it was talking just a little too loud, a little too fast. Even if there was still something to find, it would have decayed long ago. So what? Mike found a splintered desk drawer in the weeds. He glanced at it, tossed it aside, and moved a little closer to the cellar hold, where the stuff was thickest. Surely he would find something there. But what if there are ghosts? That's but what. What if I see hands coming over the edge of that cellar hold? And what if they start to come up, kids in the remains of their Easter Sunday clothes that are all rotted and torn and marked with 50 years of spring mud and fall rain and caked winter snow? Kids with no heads. He had heard at school that after the explosion, a woman had found the head of one of the victims in a tree in her backyard. Kids with no legs. Kids flayed open like codfish. Kids just like me who would maybe come down and play down there where it's dark, under the leaning iron girders and the big old rusty cogs. Oh, stop it, for the Lord's sake. But a shudder wrenched its way up his back, and he decided it was time to take something, anything, and get the dickens out of here. He reached down almost at random and came up with a gear-toothed wheel about 7 inches in diameter. He had a pencil in his pocket, and he used it quickly to dig the dirt out of the teeth. Then he slipped his souvenir in his pocket. He would go now. He would go, yes, but his feet moved slowly in the wrong direction, toward the cellar hold, and he realized with a dismal sort of horror that he needed to look down inside. He had to see. He gripped a spongy support beam leaning out of the earth and swayed forward, trying to see down and inside. He couldn't quite do it. He had come to within 15 feet of the edge, but that was still a little too far to see the bottom of the cellar hold. "I don't care if I see the bottom or not. I'm going back now. I've got my souvenir. I don't need to look down into any crummy old hole, and Daddy's note said to stay away from it." But the unhappy, almost feverish curiosity that had gripped him would not let go. He approached the cellar hold, step by queasy step, aware that as soon as the wooden beam was out of his reach, there would be no more grab holds. Also aware that the ground here was indeed squelchy and crumbly. In places along the edge, he could see depressions, like graves that had fallen in, and knew that they were the sites of previous cave-ins. Heart thudding in his chest like the hard, measured strides of a soldier's boots, he reached the edge and looked down. Nestled in the cellar hold, the bird looked up. Mike was not at first sure what he was seeing. All the nerves and pathways in his body seemed frozen, including those which conducted thoughts. It was not just the shock of seeing a monster bird, a bird whose breast was as orange as a robin's and whose feathers were the unremarkable fluffy gray of a sparrow's feathers. Most of it was the shock of the utterly unexpected. He had expected monoliths of a machinery half submerged in stagnant puddles and black mud. Instead, he was looking down into a giant nest which filled the cellar hold from end to end and side to side. It had been made out of enough timothy grass to make a dozen bales of hay, but this grass was silvery and old. The bird sat in the middle of it, its brightly ringed eyes as black as fresh warm tar, and for an insane moment before his paralysis broke, Mike could see himself reflected in each of them. Then the ground suddenly began to shift and run out from beneath his feet. He heard the tearing sound of shallow roots giving way and realized he was sliding. With a yell, he threw himself backward, pinwheeling his arms for balance. He lost it and thumped heavily to the littered ground. Some hard, dull chunk of metal pressed painfully into his back, and he had time to think of the tramp chair before he heard the whirring, explosive sound of the bird's wings. He scrambled to his knees, crawled, looked back over his shoulder, and saw it rising out of the cellar hold. Its scaly talons were a dusky orange. Its beating wings, each more than 10 feet across, blew the scraggy timothy grass this way and that, patternlessly, like the wind generated by helicopter rotors. It uttered a buzzing, chirruping scream. A few loose feathers slipped from its wings and spiraled back down into the cellar hold. Mike gained his feet again and began to run. He pounded across the field, not looking back now, afraid to look back. The bird did not look like Rodan, but he sensed it was the spirit of Rodan, risen from the cellar hold of the Kitchener Ironworks like a horrible bird in the box. He stumbled, went to one knee, got up, and ran on. The weird, chirruping, buzzing screech came again. A shadow covered him, and when he looked up, he saw the thing. It had passed less than 5 feet over his head. Its beak, dirty yellow, open and closed, revealing a pink lining inside. It whirled back toward Mike. The wind it generated washed across his face, bringing a dry, unpleasant smell with it, attic dust, dead antiques, rotting cushions. He jigged to his left, and now he saw the fallen smokestack again. He sprinted for it, running all out, his arms pumping in short, jabbing strokes at his sides. The bird screamed, and he heard its fluttering wings. They sounded like sails. Something slammed into the back of his head. Warm fire traced its way up the nape of his neck. He felt it spread as blood began to trickle down the back of his shirt collar. The bird whirled around again, meaning to pick him up with its talons and carry him away like a hawk with a field mouse, meaning to carry him back to its nest, meaning to eat him. As it flew at him, swooping down, its black, horribly alive eyes fixed on him, Mike cut sharply right. The bird missed him, barely. The dusty smell of its wings was overpowering, unbearable. Now he was running parallel to the fallen smokestack, its tiles blurring by. He could see where it ended. If he could reach the end and button hook to the left, get inside, he might be safe. He thought the bird was too big to squeeze inside. He came very close to not making it. The bird flew at him again, pulling up as it closed in, its wings flapping and pushing air in a hurricane, its scaly talons now angled toward him and descending. It screamed again, and this time Mike thought he heard triumph in its voice. He lowered his head, put his arm up, and ran straight forward. The talons closed, and for a moment the bird had him by the forearm. The grip was like the clutch of incredibly strong fingers tipped with tough nails. They bit like teeth. The bird's flapping wings were a thunder in his ears. He was dimly aware of feathers falling around him, some brushing past his cheeks like phantom kisses. The bird rose then, and for just a moment, Mike felt himself pulled upward, first straight, then on tiptoe. And for one freezing second, he felt the toes of his keds lose contact with the earth. "Let me go," he screamed at it and twisted his arm. For a moment, the talons held on, and then the sleeve of his shirt ripped. He thumped back down. The bird squalled. Mike ran again, brushing through the thing's tail feathers, gagging at that dry smell. It was like running through a shower curtain of feathers. Still coughing, eyes stinging from both tears and whatever vile dust coated the bird's feathers, he stumbled into the fallen smokestack. There was no thought now of what might be lurking inside. He ran into the darkness, his gasping sobs taking on a flat echo. He went back perhaps 20 feet and then turned toward the bright circle of daylight. His chest was rising and falling in quick jerks. He was suddenly aware that if he had misjudged either the size of the bird or the size of the smokestack's muzzle, he had killed himself as surely as if he had put his father's shotgun to his head and pulled the trigger. There was no way out. This wasn't just a pipe. It was a blind alley. The other end of the stack was buried in the earth. The bird squalled again, and suddenly the light at the end of the smokestack was blotted out as it lighted on the ground outside. He could see its yellow, scaly legs, each as thick as a man's calf. Then it cocked its head down and looked inside. Mike found himself again staring into those hideously bright, fresh tar eyes with their gold wedding rings of iris. The bird's beak opened and closed, and each time it snapped shut, he heard an audible click, like the sound you hear in your own ears when you snap your teeth together hard. Sharp, he thought. Its beak is sharp. I guess I knew birds had sharp beaks, but I never really thought about it until now. It squawked again. The sound was so loud in the tile throat of the stack that Mike clapped his hands to his ears. The bird began to force itself into the mouth of the stack. "No," Mike cried. "No, you can't." The light faded as more of the bird's body pressed its way into the stack's bore. Oh, my Lord, why didn't I remember it was mostly feathers? Why didn't I remember it could squeeze? The light faded, was gone. Now there was only an inky blackness, the suffocating attic smell of the bird, and the rustling sound of its feathers. Mike fell on his knees and began to grope on the curved floor of the smokestack, his hands spread wide, feeling. He found a piece of broken tile, its sharp edges furred with what felt like moss. He cocked his arm back and pegged it. There was a thump. The bird uttered its buzzing, chirping sound again. "Get out of here," Mike screamed. There was silence. And then that crackly, rustling sound began again as the bird resumed forcing itself into the pipe. Mike felt along the floor, found other pieces of tile, and began to throw one after another. They thumped and thudded off the bird and then clinked to the tile sleeve of the smokestack. "Please, God," Mike thought incoherently. "Please, God, please, God, please, God." It came to him that he ought to retreat down the smokestack's bore. He had run in through what had been the stack's base. It stood to reason that it would narrow as he backed up. He could retreat, yes, and listen to that low, dusty rustle as the bird worked its way in after him. He could retreat, and if he was lucky, he might get beyond the point where the bird could continue to advance. But what if the bird got stuck? If that happened, he and the bird would die in here together. They would die in here together and rot in here together in the dark. "Please, God," he screamed, and was totally unaware that he had cried out loud. He threw another piece of tile, and this time his throw was more powerful, he felt. He told the others much later, as if someone were behind him at that moment and that someone had given his arm a tremendous push. This time there was no feathery thud. Instead, there was a splattering sound, the sound a kid's hand might make slapping into the surface of a bowl of half-solidified jello. This time, the bird screamed not in anger, but in real pain. The tenebrous whir of its wings filled the smokestack. Stinking air streamed past Mike in a hurricane, flapping his clothes, making him cough and gag and retreat as dust and moss flew. Light appeared again, gray and weak at first, then brightening and shifting as the bird retreated from the stack's muzzle. Mike burst into tears, fell to his knees again, and began grubbing madly for more pieces of tile. Without any conscious thought, he ran forward with both hands full of tiling. In this light, he could see the pieces were splotched with blue-gray moss and lichen, like the surface of slate gravestones. until he was nearly at the mouth of the stack. He intended to keep the bird from coming back if he could. It bent down, cocking its head the way a trained bird on a perch will sometimes cock its head, and Mike saw where his last shot had struck home. The bird's right eye was nearly gone. Instead of that glittering bubble of fresh tar, there was a crater filled with blood. Whitish gray goo dripped from the corner of the socket and trickled along the side of the bird's beak. Tiny parasites wriggled and squirmed in this pussy discharge. It saw him and lunged forward. Mike began to throw chunks of tile at it. They struck its head and beak. It withdrew for a moment and then lunged again, beak opening, revealing the pink lining again, revealing something else that caused Mike to freeze for a moment, his own mouth dropping open. The bird's tongue was silver. Its surface as crazy cracked as the surface of a volcanic land which has first baked and then slagged off. And on this tongue, like weird tumbleweeds that had taken temporary root there, were a number of orange puffs. Mike threw the last of his tiles directly into that gaping maw, and the bird withdrew again, screaming its frustration, rage, and pain. For a moment, Mike could see its reptilian talons. Then its wings ruffled the air, and it was gone. A moment later, he lifted his face, a face that was gray-brown under the dirt, dust, and bits of moss that the bird's wind machine wings had blown at him, toward the clicking sound of its talons on the tile. The only clean places on Mike's face were the tracks that had been washed clean by his tears. The bird walked back and forth overhead. Tack, 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 tack. Mike retreated a bit, gathered up more chunks of tile, and heaped them as close to the mouth of the stack as he dared. If the thing came back, he wanted to be able to fire at it from point-blank range. The light outside was still bright, now that it was May. It wouldn't get dark for a long time yet, but suppose the bird just decided to wait. Mike swallowed, the dry sides of his throat rubbing together for a moment. Overhead, tack, 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 tack. He had a fine pile of ammunition now. In the dim light, here beyond the place where the angle of the sun made a shadow spiral inside the pipe, it looked like a pile of broken crockery swept together by a housewife. Mike rubbed the palms of his dirty hands along the sides of his jeans and waited to see what would happen next. A space of time passed before something did. Whether 5 minutes or 25, he could not tell. He was only aware of the bird walking back and forth overhead like an insomniac pacing the floor at 3 a.m. Then its wings fluttered again. It landed in front of the smokestack's opening. Mike, on his knees just behind his pile of tiling, began to peg missiles at it before it could even bend its head down. One of them slammed into a plated yellow leg and drew a trickle of blood so dark it seemed almost as black as the bird's eye. Mike screamed in triumph, the sound thin and almost lost under the bird's own enraged squawk. "Get out of here," Mike screamed. "I'm going to keep hitting you until you get out of here. I swear to God I will." The bird flew up to the top of the smokestack and resumed its pacing. Mike waited. Finally, its wings ruffled again as it took off. Mike waited, expecting the yellow feet, so like hen's feet, to appear again. They didn't. He waited longer, convinced it had to be some kind of a trick, realizing at last that that wasn't why he was waiting at all. He was waiting because he was scared to go out, scared to leave the safety of this bolt hole. Never mind stuff like that. I'm not a rabbit." He took as many chunks of tile as he could handle comfortably, then put some more inside his shirt. He stepped out of the smokestack, trying to look everywhere at once and wishing madly for eyes in the back of his head. He saw only the field stretching ahead and around him, littered with the exploded, rusting remains of the Kitchener Ironworks. He wheeled around. Sure, he would see the bird perched on the lip of the stack like a vulture, a one-eyed vulture now, only wanting the boy to see him before it attacked for the final time, using that sharp beak to jab and rip and strip. But the bird was not there. It was really gone. Mike's nerves snapped. He uttered a breaking scream of fear and ran for the weather-beaten fence between the field and the road, dropping the last pieces of tile from his hands. Most of the others fell out of his shirt as the shirt pulled free of his belt. He vaulted over the fence one-handed, like Roy Rogers showing off for Dale Evans on his way back from the corral with Pat Brady and the rest of the buckaroos. He grabbed the handlebars of his bike and ran beside it 40 feet up the road before getting on. Then he pedaled madly, not daring to look back, not daring to slow down, until he reached the intersection of Pasteur Road and Outer Main Street, where there were lots of cars passing back and forth. When he got home, his father was changing the plugs on the tractor. Will observed that Mike looked powerful, musty, and dusty. Mike hesitated for just a split second and then told his father that he had taken a tumble from his bike on the way home, swerving to avoid a pothole. "Did you break anything, Mikey?" Will asked, observing his son a little more carefully. "No, sir." "Sprains?" "Uh-uh." "Sure?" Mike nodded. "Did you pick yourself up a souvenir?" Mike reached into his pocket and found the gear wheel. He showed it to his father, who looked at it briefly and then plucked a tiny crumb of tiling from the pad of flesh just below Mike's thumb. He seemed more interested in this. "From that old smokestack?" Will asked. Mike nodded. "You go inside there?" Mike nodded again. "See anything in there?" Will asked, and then, as if to make a joke of the question, which hadn't sounded like a joke at all, he added, "Buried treasure?" Smiling a little, Mike shook his head. "Well, don't tell your mother you was mucking about in there," Will said. "She'd shoot me first and you second." He looked even more closely at his son. "Mikey, are you all right?" "Huh? You look a little peaky around the eyes." "I guess I might be a little tired," Mike said. "It's 8 or 10 miles there and back again, don't forget. You want some help with the tractor, Daddy?" "No, I'm about done screwing it up for this week. You go on in and wash up." Mike started away, and then his father called to him once more. Mike looked back. "I don't want you going around that place again," he said. "At least not until all this trouble is cleared up and they catch the man who's doing it." "You didn't see anybody out there, did you? No one chased you or hollered you down?" "I didn't see any people at all," Mike said. Will nodded and lit a cigarette. "I think I was wrong to send you out there. Old places like that, sometimes they can be dangerous." Their eyes locked briefly. "Okay, Daddy," Mike said. "I don't want to go back anyway. It was a little spooky." Will nodded again. "Less said the better, I reckon. You go and get cleaned up now and tell her to put on 3 or 4 extra sausages." Mike did. And that's that. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.